Chocolate Files. On today, World Chocolate Day, my name is Clay Gordon for TheChocolateWire from New York, and my guest today is...
I am Dr. Kristy Leissle, and I am joining you today from Accra in Ghana, my home, where I have been for the past many months since the border closure.
So you've been sheltering in place since when?
March. I was traveling for a couple weeks and got back here in March, and have really been at home mostly, and almost 100% of the time in Accra. It was very difficult to get out of Accra at first. Now it's a little bit easier, so I've been able to get a little bit out into the field, but mostly right here at my desk.
I did the math on Sunday and realized that it was 111 days that I had been in self-quarantine. And that's given me a lot of time to think about a lot of stuff. And it's one of the reasons why I started up the Chocolate Wire. And I'm really happy to have been able to start this series of interviews with friends and colleagues around the globe. And what I wanted to talk with you today was a bunch of issues around coronavirus and how it's had an impact on the day-to-day lives of cocoa farmers in Ghana, what the upcoming harvest might look like. And there are a bunch of issues having to do with COCOBOD and business around a global or a loan fund which is put together. Yep. So we start with wherever you want to start there.
Yeah, wow, gosh, lots to talk about as always, right? I mean, Ghana as the second largest cocoa producer in the world, and right next door to Ivory Coast, the largest producer. It's like we're right in the midst of it all. I mean, the cocoa industry is here basically, and so there's never not news, right? But now in the current moment, there's different kind of news than usual. Let's talk about the COVID impact first. Like I said, I've really been here in Accra, and so it's not been the case that I've been able to be out in the field with the farmers that I would usually be talking to, especially at this time of year. It's we're light crop right now, so the main season won't start for another couple of months, and so now is always a good time for me to be out in the field because the farmers, while busy, it's not as hectic as it is in September, October, November. So, we generally would have more time to just talk. I haven't been able to do that, but I have been able to talk with people who have had a little more movement between Accra and the bush, and, news travels, right? And so the sense that I've gotten really is that, while coronavirus is spreading here in Ghana, our cases continue to rise. For at least a while, it was so much contained to the cities, especially here in Accra, that I think the rural regions just didn't really think of it as an issue that would have affected them strongly. And I think business went on much as usual. Our lockdown only affected certain areas. So when we did have the true lockdown, we had 3 weeks of full lockdown. It was only Accra and Tema, which is the big port nearby, and a couple other cities in the country. And so the rural areas pretty much went on as usual. The sense that I have been getting is that farmers and people who are living in the villages really thought, well, we've had many diseases afflicting us for centuries, right? And nobody's really, helped us with these things. And now you're telling us to wash our hands all the time. And so we don't even have running water. And so this was the sense I got, was that it was very much like, we have to just carry on like usual. And let's maybe think about the diseases that are really affecting us and have been for some time. And so, I never have gotten the sense here that there was a significant disruption to the cocoa movement, that's for sure. I have not heard, unlike in Nigeria, where some of the cocoa has been held up at the ports, certainly at destination, there are some issues. But here, I have just not heard of reports of anything moving in an unusual way. Having said that, we're also in the late crop, like I said, and the big volumes don't come until later in the year, and the big export volumes especially don't really start rolling out until October, November. And so I don't know if there was just fortunate timing. We might have seen a very different scenario if this happened at a different time of the year.
Well, from what I've been able to gather, talking with people, we certainly have seen something which is very, very different in both Ecuador and Peru, for example. I know Ecuador was on very strict lockdown. It was impossible to move from province to province. There was mandatory curfew with you could be arrested if you're out of your house in Guayaquil, and farmers couldn't go to their farms to do work without special permits and without special papers. And so the crop was heavily affected there and in Peru. Do you know anything about what's happening next door? Is the situation in Cote d'Ivoire similar to what's going on in Ghana, or is it impossible to tell because of a lack of movement? Or
I won't say anything for sure because obviously I don't have firsthand experience or evidence, and my connections in Ivory Coast aren't as many as they are here in Ghana. But what I will say, I do feel comfortable extrapolating from history because even during the height of civil conflict in Ivory Coast, in a decade or so ago, maybe a bit longer than that, the cocoa always moved, right? And so unlike in Peru, unlike in Ecuador, even though they're big producers, here in West Africa, if you're Ivory Coast and Ghana, if you don't have cocoa moving, then your economy cannot function. And so, there has not been a historical circumstance that's really prevented cocoa from moving around in its usual ways when it's being produced at volume. And so I think that my guess is that in Ivory Coast, things have also continued more or less as they usually would have. Certainly right now, the farmers that the reports have been reading, are that the farmers are pretty happy with the way main crop is looking for the fall. They're the light crop, it always suffers because it's coming during the rainy season. And so there's always questions around spoilage there. But I think the cocoa here is just too big for even coronavirus, right? to kind of put the kibosh on it.
Yeah, here in the United States, we use the phrase for a bank, something too big to fail, right? So in Ghana and the Ivory Coast, cocoa is such an integral part of the economy and a major part of the GDP, a significant portion of exports. There's an old Robert Heinlein novel in which one of the lines is, "The roads must roll," right? And this is very, 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 very similar to that. So I think that makes an interesting segue. One of the things which makes Ghana different from Cote d'Ivoire is the presence of the government COCOBOD, COCOBOD, and how it has essentially 100% control over the market in Ghana. It sets the price. It's the only entity that I think is legally able to set the price. It is the only entity that can legally buy and sell cocoa. And if you want to be able to even buy cocoa locally, let alone export it, you need to have a license in order to be able to handle it. So how did
can I just interrupt to say that the control is really at the point of export. So you can be a private company and buy here domestically. You just have to sell to COCOBOD. So you can't buy and then export, right? And so it's like that, the control is really at the moment of export. But as you say, it's 100% control at that point. But historically, the government buying company, PBC, produce buying company, had a monopoly on domestic purchases as well. But, since the 90s, that has privatized to a large extent. And so domestic buying is still, you can buy as long as you have the license, but then you are obliged to sell to COCOBOD, which then will do the marketing on the international market.
So if I want to purchase cocoa for local production, so I'm a chocolate maker in Accra, I can buy beans locally. I can process the beans. No. Let's say yes and no. Let's say yes and no. So how do I put it? It happens all the time, but it's technically not supposed to happen. So, but there's a thriving craft industry here.
even though it's not quite what COCOBOD
A gray
had in
market, if not a black market.
Yeah,
A
that's
brown,
a great
a brown market.
It's a great, a cocoa brown market.
Okay. So, but one of the things that I think that many people may not know is that because there is this global focus on the market price, right, there's not enough focus on what I think is even more important, which is the Farmgate price. So can you talk a little bit about how the Farmgate price is set in Ghana?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's like one of the few places really in the cocoa growing world where we can say with confidence, you know, how the process happens, despite the fact that we don't have total transparency in some of the figures. And so, you know, basically every year, you know, the producer price, what the farmers get paid at Farmgate is a percentage of the FOB price, which is the price that Ghana Cocoa Board receives at the point of export, right? And so the producer price is generally around 70% nowadays of the amount that Cocoa Board receives for the cocoa after it takes its other deduction, which is to fund its own activities, which are very important, right? And so there's kind of two deductions that get made. One is like
so
Cocoa Board.
It's 70% net, not 70% gross.
Yeah.
Oh wow.
And so that's I mean, it's not much discussed, but it's I mean, it's an important thing because, you know, Cocoa Board gets a lot of criticism for its control, but at the same time, and I'm not going to say that the percentage that they take to do their activities, it's like, I'm not a farmer, so I can't really speak to this from firsthand experience, but farmers have certainly told me many times over the years that they're not sure where that money is going. You know, at the same time, at least as many farmers have been able to point to quite a bit of extension work, you know, provision of seedlings, like guidance from Cocoa Board. I mean, the grading system, you know, that keeps the consistency here very high. All of these things have to get paid for, right? And so, you know, farmers on the one hand really appreciate those things and they can name them and point specifically to those things, even as they critique the fact that perhaps not all of the money is being reinvested into development of rural communities as they would wish. So it's a little bit of a tricky thing because on the one hand, everybody's really aware of the way like the tax on cocoa is necessary to support the industry. But who's gonna ever argue that like the tax is too low, right? like it's like, so it's quite a delicate thing. And I'm very glad that I'm not in charge of calculating those numbers because I don't know what I would do, quite frankly, if that was my job.
But you touched on something which I think is really, really quite important, is that there's a level of consistent quality which is coming out of Ghana, which is one of the, I think, very, very good things that COCOBOD has been able to do over the course of several decades. I mean, I talk about this in a slightly different way, which is if you were to do unaided brand recognition, just ask a general consumer without prompting them, name the highest quality chocolate, right? What you think it is, right? And they'll name companies like Lindt,
yes,
and Neuhaus and Godiva.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That's all West Africa.
Yeah.
So irrespective of what we think about as, you know, fine cocoa or fine chocolate, and I'm not a fan of the word fine because it gives us an excuse to be able to say that the work of 95% of the farmers in the world is beneath our attention because they're not growing Trinitarios or Criollos. So I think it's inherently a bad term. But nonetheless, the world standard for what most people think of as the best quality chocolate in the world is rooted in Ghana.
Yeah.
Right. And this is this sort of really, I think, fundamental kind of cognitive dissonance that's going on.
Completely. I mean, like, on two different levels, I feel really strongly about this. One is just my personal relationship with chocolate. It's like, I will sit here and eat Kit Kat and M&Ms all day if you put them in front of me. I will, and I've always been like that because that's what I fell in love with, growing up. That's what I ate. And like, I didn't suddenly have this moment. I feel like many people maybe in the craft chocolate industry talk about this kind of moment of enlightenment where they realize that all the chocolate they've been loving their whole life was garbage. I've never had that. Like, I've always loved the flavor of chocolate, which, as you say, is the flavor of West Africa, especially Ghana. And that's just like, so to me, on a personal level, I will never reject that flavor. And I have always embraced it. As a scholar and an analyst, and especially as a writer, I feel very much like the language that we use to talk about the kind of cocoa that comes from this part of the world has tended to be harmful, right? And like, it's not celebrated, it's not honored, it's not recognized because there is so much focus on what, rightly or wrongly, has been categorized as fine flavor. And so I think the whole system is totally subjective, right? And like, when you have a system that's like 100% based on subjectivity, then someone has made a decision at some point about what counts as better or worse quality. And so, when I analyze it from that perspective, I think West Africa really gets the short end of the stick here. And like, for me, like, the whole book I'm working on now is like a corrective to that. It's like, let's try and be a little bit more recognizing and aware and acknowledging of what's happened here.
Well, if you need an early reader and want some input for the back cover, please let me know. I would
absolutely love that.
I'm going to go out on a realm, and here in the United States, when we're worrying about over-policing and institutional racism, which has erupted around the death of George Floyd and a lot of other people, there's a weird kind of reverse racism in language in cocoa and chocolate. I'm going to go out on a limb and be real un-PC here and say, when it comes to cocoa beans, we love white beans. But when it comes to chocolate, we like black chocolate.
Yeah.
And am I in trouble for saying that?
No, I mean, I think I think of it in a similar way, but with different words, I think, because for me, it's like, even though I study the race and gendered aspects of this industry as part of my main work, like, so much of what I was just describing for me is really part of our feelings about Africa. It's like, it's an anti-Africa position, which obviously is tied up with race. You can't take those two things apart. But it's also like different to the kind of issues that, like, the egregious things that we're seeing happening in America right now, because it's really, to me, tied up with like, what do we think about Africa and African people, and how does that affect the way the industry in general perceives cocoa from this part of the world? And so obviously it's like, you can't take the race, you can't take race out of that. It's part of it. But I think we also need to remember that Africa has something to do with it as well. And so it's extremely complicated, and it's really emotional. I spend my entire professional life like in this part of the world, like working in this industry that is dismissed in a sentence, by, very often by people who've never been here, and like, it's just, oh, well, those beans are rubbish. And it's very upsetting to me. And if it's upsetting to me, like it has to be 10,000 times worse for the people doing the work, you know, like my work is work, but it's not work like what a farmer does.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I just got done writing and publishing an article around the 4th of July, celebrating, 111 days in self-isolation, and for World Chocolate Day today, around the notion of who decides what's fair.
Yeah.
And part of my lead into it is, I am a 62-year-old white male. Who am I to lecture anyone about the concept of fairness? I mean, the kinds of overt discrimination which other people experience are not a part of my daily experience. Yet at the same time, what I can say, I'm a human. I can empathize. This is not the way I want to be treated. So I can do what it is that I can to work to help, right?
Yes.
Make sure that these kinds of injustices, for want of a better terms, are not visited on other kinds of people.
Yes.
Let's jump tracks here a little bit. One of the things that was in the news last week was the change of ownership at Divine Chocolate, right? And so many people don't know that Divine Chocolate is a business which was founded in large part by a major cocoa cooperative in Ghana, Kuapa Kokoo, and to some extent it operates within, but kind of outside, the COCOBOD framework, right? It's a special case, and it's the only one that I'm aware of. But how do what do you think the future of Kuapa Kokoo is in this? And can you explain what happened in the purchase?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and just I've worked very closely since I ever started cocoa research in West Africa. In the field, I've worked very closely with both Kuapa Kokoo and Divine. And so like I don't know if it needs to be a disclaimer, but like but it's just I can speak to the relationship and the recent process, having done so much work with them over the years. And by work, I mean research, right?
So I knew that, which is one of the reasons why I asked the question. I knew that you had this relationship, and so. And do you know David Greenwood Haig? So he did some work for Divine quite some time ago. I'm actually interviewing him tomorrow.
Oh, are you?
And he'll be able to talk about this relationship from a slightly different perspective. But
Absolutely.
Anyway, because I think it's really, really important. Many people, so I had a chance, gonna rabbit trail this conversation just a little bit. I visited Belize like 4 times between 2007 and 2010. And had a chance to visit the Toledo Cacao Growers Association, which was the source for much of the cocoa the green and blacks used for their Maya Gold bar. And this is at a time when they paid for a person to live basically full time down in Punta Gorda to oversee, to make sure that the farmers reported things properly, that money which got sent to the co-op was actually distributed, the farmers knew what the price was, what the premiums got paid in, all that kind of stuff. And when they got purchased by Cadbury, or when Josephine Fairley and Craig Sams sold to Cadbury, and then Cadbury was bought out by Kraft, and then that whole business got spun out into Mondelez, that whole sense of personal responsibility, this is Josephine and Craig taking personal responsibility for making sure that fair trade got implemented properly down on the co-op, that the new owners didn't feel the same sense of responsibility. Now, if I'm right, if I remember correctly, the new owner is actually the company that's been manufacturing the chocolate all along.